Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. So, as Mike said, my name's Larch. I came across Extinction Rebellion in August last year and thought, wow, this is what I've been waiting for 24 years. Because 24 years ago, I had the luxury privilege of being taught in my master's about climate change and took a year out of my master's to campaign full-time on it because I realised it was the most serious, biggest issue that we have to get our heads around and have to deal with. That was 24 years ago, and I'd tried all sorts of things to deal with it and work on it, and personal action, looking at my diet and how I live my lifestyle, and trying to lobby government and all the rest of it, taking direct action, but nothing seemed to work. And so Extinction Rebellion is a really effective way to actually bring about change on climate change. So that's why I had this wow, this is what I've been waiting for 24 years. So I've actually taken a year out of my 2 jobs to work full-time, volunteer on Extinction Rebellion. So yeah, it's a real privilege to be doing this work and to be sharing this with you today. So when we're looking at extinction, the risk of extinction that we now face because of climate change and the ecological crisis, it brings up lots of emotions for us, and that's okay, that's natural, that's normal. It means we're paying attention. It means we're actually opening to the truth and letting the truth in, because the truth is challenging, it brings up stuff. So when we're doing this work of facing this directly and honestly, it was really important that we support ourselves in that. So not to be on our own, to let all the stuff come up around it, the thoughts, the feelings, the emotions, let them come up, but also not to be on our own with that. So we really encourage people to have other people to work with, to talk with, to share it. So what we do in this talk is we have 3 little breaks where the first one is just going to get you to meet your neighbour, just to say what brought you here tonight. But then 2 other breaks in the talk in the middle and at the end where we'll just get you to share with that same neighbour the sort of your response as we go through to the different parts of the talk. Brilliant, great, thank you very much. I'm glad that's working. Great. So there are 3 parts to this talk. The first part is introductions, which we haven't quite finished because I'm also going to introduce Extinction Rebellion next. And then there's a bit about the science and where we're at in terms of the climate science, but also political, where we're at politically, so it's like the landscape. And then the third part, and then we'll have a break, a little break, one of those mini breaks where you share with your neighbour. And then the last part is about what we can do about it. Okay? So the first part then, introducing Extinction Rebellion. Extinction Rebellion was launched on the 31st of October last year with our Declaration of Rebellion. And it's had an amazing kind of pickup. People have just really, it's kind of hit a need just at the right time. People have said, this is what we need right now. I've been worrying about this, but not even really fully aware how much I was worrying about it. And this is showing me that I can do something. Because most people switch off, don't let it all in about climate change because, well, there's nothing I can do about it. So why would I even kind of worry about that stuff? But actually, this is showing that we can. So people are jumping on board. It's amazing. The pickup is incredible. We've got our international rebellion sort of launch on the 15th of April, but already we're in 119 countries around the world. There was at least one person who's stepped up to register with us and join the rebellion in 119 countries around the world. We've got hundreds of groups like we're forming today in Northampton that have formed all over the country and all over the world already. So that's incredible. It's showing the value of it. And why is that? It's because we're bringing non-violent direct action, civil disobedience, to this issue of climate change. So we've had lots of people working on climate change but not using mass participation, civil disobedience before, and that's why it's the fastest growing movement on climate change there's ever been. So we have 10 principles and values. One of the things that gave me kind of real hope and trust that I could get involved with Extinction Rebellion when I first came across it was the fact that there are these 10 principles and values, and they really help to hold the movement in a really safe, really amazing way. So the first of those is that we have a shared vision of change, a vision that will allow 7 generations to flourish. So a vision of change which isn't just about short-term opportunism, it's about long-term vision, long-term that we can all get behind. So we have a shared vision of change. We do what's necessary. So necessary to mobilise enough people to bring about the changes we need. So it's not like we need everybody on board, we need enough people. So the research shows that we need around 3.5% of people to make a change, to stand up and say, yes, I stand for this, I want this change, and to help us put that into practice. So this is drawing on 100 years of change in the suffragettes, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and more recent changes like the Tahrir Square Revolution, the Arab Spring, all sorts of different movements that have, we learned from them all. And from that we see that we don't need everyone on board, we just need enough people. So we do what's necessary. We need a regenerative culture. So our well-being personally, our well-being collectively, and our well-being in terms of the whole planet and the environment is really important. We need to regenerate our culture for us individually and for us collectively. And we do that as a movement. So we look after ourselves as activists and getting involved as rebels, getting involved with this rebellion, and we look after each other. And we also trying to shift that wider society so that it's a regenerative culture rather than all the social problems that we're seeing with isolation, loneliness, etc. at the moment. We also openly challenge ourselves and the system. So that's another one of our principles. We openly challenge ourselves and the system. We value reflecting and learning. So we do something, we try an action, we try an idea, we reflect on it, we learn from that, and we try something that's hopefully better next time. So we're really constantly, openly learning as we go. We have that humility to say we haven't got all the answers, we're working this out as we go along. We welcome everyone and every part of everyone. We're a really inclusive movement, and we really want, showing up as you have done today is all you need to do. That is brilliant. We could all just show up whatever we're like. So whatever state we don't need to be any particular thing to be part of this movement. We just, as we are, show up, and that's enough. We mitigate for power. What that means is we recognise that in our society there is bias, there is prejudice, there is privilege that some of us have because of those biases. So I, as a white man, have privileges that I haven't had to earn just because of the nature that I'm white and I'm a man in a racist, sexist society. So we try and mitigate for that. We try and recognise that that exists. We don't beat ourselves up about it, but we do what we can to take responsibility for that and support everyone in our movement to have a fair chance of playing their part, because this movement needs everyone that wants to get involved at whatever level they want to get involved. We don't blame and shame. So it's very easy to say, yeah, the problem, it's the government, it's the corporations, it's the, whoever. But actually we're all part of this problem. We're all burning fossil fuels, we're all consuming on some level. And time is so short and the challenge is so big that we don't have time to waste on our energy on blaming and shaming. We've got to get on with the task in hand, which is huge enough as it is, of bringing forward the solutions, bringing the change that we need. So we don't get involved in blaming and shaming. And one of the reasons we don't get involved in blaming and shaming is because we're non-violent. We're a non-violent network, and that includes our language and how we speak to each other. So that's really fundamental value that we stand for. If you want to be part of our actions, part of our movement, you have to agree to being non-violent. And then finally, we work through autonomy and decentralisation, so that as a group is working on a particular topic, they have the freedom. As long as we're all agreed and aligned with the principles and values, we can get on and work. So we don't have to constantly check with everyone. We don't need to get everyone agreeing on something. We just need the people that we're working with to be trusted to do the stuff they're doing, because they're the experts in that bit. And they'll check in with a few others, but basically we've got the autonomy and to get on with doing stuff that we're working on. So it gives us kind of freedom to kind of get on with stuff, and again, it's allowing everyone to play their part. And the tactics we use are evolving all the time. They're only limited really by our imagination, and of course, as long as they're aligned with the principles and values. We do things like road blocking in different ways. Swarming is a particular technique we use. As you might have seen, we occupied the bridges in London, so we used mass people, thousands of people, 6,000 people that was, occupying 5 bridges in London. We sometimes use lock-ons and glue-ons. You can see people there with their hands glued to Department of Environment, and we sometimes do spray chalking and that sort of thing. But when we do something like spray chalking, we do it in a way where we are accountable for it. So we might do that spray chalking and then we'll stay there to get arrested if they're going to arrest us. So that's quite a different thing than what we do. But increasingly our tactics are much more towards anyone can get involved. We don't need equipment like the lock-ons. We just need lots of people joining us. So that's increasingly the way we're going with our tactics. So, second part, the landscape, where are we at? Where are we at with the science and where are we at with the politics and the law? Now, could spend a lot of time talking about the science. We're going to try and get through this fairly quickly. The key things we're trying to communicate in this bit about the science is to bring you up to speed where we have the discourse, the kind of way it's portrayed in the media and by the government, and then we've got the climate reality of what the climate is actually doing and what some of the scientists that are actually switched on to that are saying. So what we're trying to do in this part of the talk is to shift from what the politicians and the media are saying in the mainstream to actually where the climate really is. And so there are a few key kind of parts to explain about that. So the first thing is the precautionary principle. So this is a really valuable principle that all main governments are signed up to. They're all behind it. So yes, it makes a lot of sense. If there's a serious risk, if something happened, it would be so bad that we shouldn't take that risk. Even if the science isn't completely clear, if we know there's a serious risk, the precautionary principle says we don't take that risk. And so what we're seeing with climate change is there's a huge risk, but we haven't been applying the precautionary principle. And the reason, another in terms of setting the scene, the other thing to say is how we value our resources, our sources, and what kind of information we use. So what a climate scientist will say down the pub is much more frank and uncensored than what they'll say when they come to write it up in an academic paper. When they write it in a paper, it'll take longer, and they'll only say what they can prove, the facts that they can prove. When you come to get a science paper that's then reviewing all of the other science papers in that little bit of an area of science, it'll be a bit more conservative again, it'll take a bit longer, and it might be a bit more rigorous because it's taking a wider pool of knowledge, a wider pool of research that it's drawing on. And the ultimate end of that spectrum is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's the world's top scientists all coming together to agree on what the clear science is on climate change. And so the last IPCC report, which came out at the end of last year, it took 2.5 years to produce and involved 6,000 papers being reviewed. So it's really rigorous, really robust, but it takes a long time to produce. And there are serious problems with it, which we've increasingly seen over the last 10 or 11 years. We've seen lots of scientists saying, hang on, there are problems with the IPCC report. What we've done, one of the mistakes we've made in the last 30 years, and I hold my hand up to say I've made that mistake, is I've defaulted to the IPCC. When talking about climate science, we've sort of said, okay, what does the IPCC say? That's where the climate science is at. But the reality is, for a whole range of reasons, the IPCC isn't the only source we should rely on, because it's very slow. So the process is much slower than the reality of accelerating climate change out in the real world. So it has a systematic tendency to understatement. And it also has, for example, political input. So the latest report that came out, the executive summary for policymakers, every word of that report was agreed by politicians. It wasn't just a scientific report, it's also a political document. So there are a whole range of problems with the IPCC. It's limited. It shouldn't be the only thing we rely on. So in this talk, we draw on a range of sources, including the IPCC, but not limited to it. So this is what happens when we rely on just, say, the IPCC or the more mainstream models. As you can see there, the different models have got different colours, and they predict that ice in the Arctic to be declining over time, but maybe it would take as long as 2080 or 2090 until we lose all summer ice in the Arctic. But the reality from the actual data, which is the black line, is much quicker than that. It looks like we're going to lose all of the ice in the Arctic as soon as 2020 or 2025, somewhere in the next few years. So if we just relied on the models, we would be way underestimating what's actually happening in the real world. And this is what we see throughout the climate science, is that every time the scientists come back from the field, we have to rewrite the models, because the accelerating climate change is much quicker than the models have been forecasting, models have been predicting. And why is that? That's because of a number of factors, which I'm just going to talk about now. The first one is global dimming. So as we emit into the atmosphere, we don't just emit CO2, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, we also emit particulates and aerosols, and they have the effect of screening some of the sunlight. So some of the sun's energy gets blocked from hitting the Earth. That's called global dimming, and that has a discernible effect. It reduces the climate change impacts from the gases that we've already emitted. And the science, there hasn't been enough science on this. The IPCC doesn't really cover global dimming because there's not a clear thing. You can't say exactly, oh yeah, global dimming is causing 0.5 of a degree difference. But we know that it's in a range and that it's around 0.5 of a degree of difference. It could be up to 1 degree of difference. So when we stop emitting all the fossil fuels and burning the fossil fuels that we're doing at the moment and stop generating the pollution, which we have to do, we will remove the dimming effect. The aerosols will clear from the Earth. It's in a matter of months and couple of years. So quite quickly the aerosols will go and we'll lose the global dimming effect. So the temperature will jump between 0.5 degree and 1 degree because we've removed the dimming effect. So we're already at 1.1 degrees of warming. So you remove the dimming effect, we've jumped up quite a bit already. So that shows the IPCC report, the last one, said we have to keep it at 1.5, otherwise we face very, very serious catastrophe, huge consequences. But it's, you can see just from looking at global dimming alone that the challenge to keep it at 1.5, when we're already at 1.1 and we take away the aerosols and the particulates, we remove global dimming, we're up to maybe 1.6, 1.5, we're certainly already there. And that's just one factor. Another factor that's really important is climate lag. So climate lag is when, basically the emissions that happen, there's a lag between their full global warming impacts. So it's a 10 to 20 year lag. So the heating that we're seeing now, the increase in temperature, the huge impacts of fires and droughts and impacts we're seeing around the world, that's from the emissions we did 10 and 20 years ago. And what have emissions done in the last 10 and 20 years? They've accelerated. The last couple of years was the biggest acceleration we've seen of emissions. So we're already, because of climate lag, expecting quite a significant additional heating, up to another degree because of climate lag. So between global dimming and climate lag, we know that it's a lot more serious than the mainstream politicians and the mainstream media are portraying it. And then there are some other things called called feedbacks. I don't like calling them positive feedbacks because they're scary feedbacks. They're not positive at all, but they're feedback loops. So you get a certain amount of heating and you generate natural processes which give you even more heating. So this one is called the albedo effect. So the snow and the ice are a reflective surface. They bounce back a lot of the sun's energy. So as you get a certain amount of heating and the snow and the ice melts, you replace that snow and the ice with dark water and with land, which absorb much more heat. So that alone in the Arctic, once we lose our ice cover in the Arctic alone, will have the same impact as half of all of human emissions. So that one feedback of once we get to a certain level of warming and we lose the albedo effect, as we're predicted to do in the next few years in the summer, will have an additional heating impact. So that's the loss of the albedo effect. So that is one of 72 feedbacks that have been identified. So we know that these feedbacks exist. The IPCC doesn't really deal with them properly. So that's another criticism of the IPCC. So another example of these 72 feedbacks is the Amazon. The Amazon is currently the lungs of our planet. It's one of the most important ways we lock up CO2. At the moment, the Amazon is a store of CO2. It's a sink for CO2. It locks up CO2 by the plants growing, the leaves falling, and then rotting as soil. And soil stores a lot of carbon. When we hit a certain level of heating, the Amazon becomes a net emitter of CO2. And at the moment, the forecast is that that's at 3 degrees of warming. So if you consider, we're already at 1.1. If we get to 3 degrees of warming, the Amazon will go from a net sink of CO2 to a net emitter. And this science isn't precise and exact. We're already seeing, as we see in this picture here, fires in the Amazon. So in some areas, it's already emitting CO2 instead of locking it down. So as we carry on this path that we're on of increased warming, we start to see these feedback loops kicking in. And what happens then is these feedbacks interact with each other, and they're called tipping cascades. So what happens is you get these, if you start to get a certain number of these feedback loops kicking in, they'll then trigger other feedbacks. And so a report came out last year called the Hothouse Earth report, which was looking at these impacts, combined impacts, and it talked about the hothouse Earth, because the geological record shows that we've got two rough states for the Earth that it has been in over geological time. There's a state when we have ice caps, North and South Pole, and there's a state when we don't. And what we're in danger of doing with climate change, with the impacts that we're having at the moment, is flipping the Earth to the state when it doesn't have ice on the poles. And of course, that alone, because we'll lose that massive albedo effect, will have a huge additional warming. So what happens when we go into the Earth tends to flip. So these processes could easily generate 5 or 6 degrees of warming. When we talk about a degree, it doesn't sound like a big thing, but when we're talking about a degree of heating within the planetary system, it's huge. So we've had, we can all identify the problems that we're seeing around the world at the moment. The huge forest fires in America, the hurricanes in America, the weird intense weather that we get here, the intense rainfall, the storms. All of this is happening around the world, and to the point where between 300,000 and 400,000 people die every year around the world already because of climate change. And that's with 1.1 degree of warming. Once we hit 1.5, it gets a lot more serious. Once we hit 2, it's a whole different ballgame. Beyond 2, it starts to get the whole of, the ability to maintain society, a civilization, has been in this particular geological period called the Holocene. And we have now left the Holocene. We are now in the Anthropocene. Humans have had such an impact on the planet that we are now the dominant force, and that it's changed the kind of epoch, the way geologists divide up the period of the Earth. And this kind of paper sort of talks about why that is and what might happen. We've been talking about, so the reason that the description of the climate change is as though it's over here, and the reality is over here. The description has been as though we're walking down a slope, gently down a slope, and we're emitting more, and at some point we can kind of see the sense in our ways, we can stop emitting more, and we can walk back up the slope. But that isn't an accurate metaphor. The metaphor is much more like we're rolling a ball down a really steep hill. And if we roll it at the very first part of that hill, we can catch it and bring it back again. But there's at some point when we roll that ball down the hill, we won't be able to catch it again. We don't know exactly where that point is, but we know that it's somewhere soon. We may have already hit it, and there's some very strong arguments for saying we've already hit it and we're already committed to runaway climate change. But we don't know that for sure. We know that 2 degrees is very likely to be, we're talking about runaway climate change at 2 degrees. Because that's what the science is showing. So we know that this phenomenon exists. We know that at some point we'll lose control of that ball and there'll be runaway climate change, and we'll have lost our agency as a species to really deal with it. But we don't know where that is. What we do know is that UN General Secretary said that we've got this year, 12 months, to turn this around, to go from emissions climbing every year to them coming down really rapidly. So that was all focusing on climate change, and the thing is, to put that into perspective, that is just one, it's probably the most significant, but it's just one of a series of planetary boundaries that we're crossing, ways we're impacting the planet and the ability of the natural systems to kind of generate and moderate and control themselves. So we're having a massive impact. This is, there was a report came out a few years ago called the Planetary Boundaries Report, and that was looking at these different planetary boundaries, and it shows how we're exceeding them in many areas. Biodiversity is a really significant one, and habitat loss is a really significant one. Those alone, the loss of biodiversity because of habitat loss and increasingly because of climate change, that alone threatens our survival as a species. So we know that there have been 5 major extinctions in the geological record. The most significant one, the late Permian, saw the loss of 96% of all life on Earth. And what we've generated now is these changes through entering the Anthropocene that are equivalent or even faster than what we saw that led to the late Permian mass extinction. So we've already entered the 6th mass extinction. The extinction rates now are up to 10,000 times the natural background rate of extinction that we would expect to see because of all of these human activities, because of climate change and habitat loss particularly. The World Wide Fund research came out last year which said that since the 1970s, 60% of mammals, fish, amphibians, vertebrates have died because of human activities, 60%. And that alone threatens our survival as a species, because we need a diversity of species, a thriving ecosystem in order for us to survive as a species. At the moment, we've now dominated the global ecosystem to the extent that only 4% of mammals on this planet are wild. So 60% are our pets and our livestock, and 36% of mammals is us. So our population has grown to such an extent, and our impact on the planet, the way we've chosen to live, is so vast that we've taken way more than our space on this planet. We're not allowed enough space for the rest of the ecosystem to maintain itself and to regenerate. And so this paper by Zhu and Ramanathan is one of the most respected climate scientists in the world, and he looked at these kind of scenarios, what would happen, and what could happen. And he actually, for once, instead of censoring himself, so most scientists for the last 30 years have censored themselves. They've said, okay, this is what the data's saying, but what will people actually hear, and what will because if I tell it how it is, maybe it will scare people and they'll just, they won't believe it, or they'll just deny it, or they'll just go, rabbit in the headlights and freeze and do nothing. So most scientists have tried to sort of second guess what people are ready to hear and willing to hear. But increasingly over the last few years, we've had scientists stepping up and just telling the truth as it is. And this is an example of that. So in this paper, he said, actually, as a species, we have a 5% risk of extinction because of the risks of climate change. He looked at what would happen if we had 5 degrees of warming, and he said that there is no description for that. That's beyond catastrophic. Catastrophic was 4 degrees of warming. What would happen at 5 degrees of warming? There was no name for it, so he called it unknown, because we would be going into the unknown. But we're at serious risk of triggering warming at 5 or 6 degrees at the moment if we carry on the way we are for the next year. So what has the political response been to this? The political response over the last 30 years since the IPCC first said climate change is really serious, we need to deal with this or we face a risk of societal collapse. The political response has been inadequate. We've seen emissions rise every single year, and in fact there's been a massive increase, and as I said, emissions are even accelerating now the last couple of years. So the political response has been inadequate. When faced with this existential threat, the government has recently, in the UK, for example, given the green light to a Heathrow expansion, which will add a huge amount of emissions. The Heathrow decision alone will add the emissions, the equivalent of Cyprus, a whole country, to the atmosphere, just that one decision. They're also promoting and have been promoting fracking, which brings a whole another load of fossil fuels online, as dirty as coal, and against the wishes of people. No one in this country really wants fracking. The communities have said very strongly they don't want it. The government's tried to push it through undemocratically, and most importantly, not in response to this existential threat that we face. So the political response has been adequate. We can't rely on it. What about the legal response? So there have been some really brilliant organisations like Plan B that have taken governments to court over their inadequacy and their failure, to their negligence around climate change. But the governments have just avoided and delayed at every stage. We cannot rely on the legal process alone, because the thing now is so urgent. We've got this 12-month period to turn it around. So the legal work is really important, and we work closely with Plan B and with other organisations that are taking this legal work, but we cannot rely on it alone. So that's the landscape, that's where we find ourselves now. So that's the heavy bit of this talk. So I'll just give you now a moment, a minute just to sit and in silence to reflect on that, and then a minute each to share again with your neighbours that you've met earlier. Great, thank you everyone, thank you. So we do the minute of silence just because it's so, I think one of the reasons we've failed to kind of address this for the last 30 years is that it's so easy to be so busy and not really let it in. So it's really important that we just allow ourselves a bit of time every now and again just to let ourselves actually accept and hear and relate to what's going on. So the third part of the talk now is what we can do about it. This is the good news. So in terms of social responses, just a little bit of a political theory here. So Thomas Hobbes was like the arch conservative political theorist who he came up with this concept of the social contract. So whether we're drawing on left, right or centre political theory or political positions, we've got very strong kind of arguments for saying we should be acting on this right now. We need to hold the government to account. So I'll just take an example of the conservative perspective, which is Thomas Hobbes. And he said there's a social contract between the government and the people. The people give some of our power up to the government because it will keep us safe. It will look after us and look after our rights. When the government, and Thomas Hobbes said, when the government breaks that social contract, when it fails to keep us safe, it becomes our duty to rebel because it's broken the social contract. And so that's what we're arguing is happening now. The government has broken the social contract. It's failed to act on climate change for 30 years, knowing the science for 30 years. And so it hasn't kept us safe. We are now faced with a risk of extinction. We're faced with this existential threat. So the government has broken the social contract, so it becomes our duty to rebel. There are so many solutions. One of the great things about the IPCC report that I just mentioned that came out last year, one of the things it said was it's urgent. So it's the first time the IPCC has been as bold as to say actually it's an urgent crisis. So if the most conservative view on the climate science spectrum is saying it's an urgent crisis, we know that it's really an urgent crisis. But they also said we lack the political will. We don't lack the solutions. We've got so many solutions out there. All we lack is the political will. And here are some of the examples. There's an organisation in the States called Drawdown, Project Drawdown, and they've got 100 solutions that they say, yeah, if we did these, if we were serious about these, we'd start to address climate change. So they talk about a decade of transition, so making it serious, like everything we do in that decade is shifting really rapidly towards a transition away from fossil fuels, towards actually drawing down CO2 and reducing demand is part of that. We can rebuild our transport infrastructure, so it's based on walking, cycling, accessibility for everyone rather than need to travel loads of huge distances to get to the services you need to see your friends and family. We can restore agriculture so that it's regenerative. Like at the moment, agriculture is a huge contributor to emissions. But we have the knowledge of how to feed ourselves in a way that regenerates, actually locks up and stores CO2 rather than emitting methane and CO2 from our agriculture. And we can transform our ecosystems so we can have a half-earth policy where we restore half of the earth to wilderness. Because when nature's left to get on its own and do its thing, it locks up CO2 and it massively increases biodiversity. And that's what we need right now. We need to kind of halt this mass extinction process that we've brought about, and it will also help us address climate change by restoring ecosystems. Then so Extinction Rebellion, we have 3 demands. The first demand is that the government tell the truth about climate change and declare a climate emergency and use the media to educate the public about the climate emergency. That way we're all in it together and everyone will understand what's going on. The second is that then the government make legally binding commitment to go zero carbon in the UK by 2025. And that is completely achievable. And in fact, it's needed because whilst the latest report from the IPCC said that we need to go zero carbon globally by 2030, the reality is that UK is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It's got one of the biggest debts of emissions that we've been doing historically. So if globally we need to get there by 2030, in the UK we need to get there by 2025 to show the way, to show leadership and to support the rest of the world to come join us on this path. And so both of those things then rely on the most important of our demands in a way, which is the Citizens' Assembly. So we have a Citizens' Assembly that is ordinary people selected by a process called sortition, which means that it's representative of the whole population of the UK. So say we've got 52% of women in the UK and 48% of men. On the Citizens' Assembly, a panel of maybe 500 people, there will be 52% of women and 48% of men. And we'll do that across all the different kind of aspects of society that we need to represent within the Assembly. And that's a process that's tried and tested. We've done it in several countries now around the world for different times, and it's worked really well. In fact, the basis of democracy was on sortition. When democracy was first founded, we've lost our way with democracy, and so now our current democracy in the UK is just not fit for purpose. It's not capable of addressing this fundamental crisis that we face. So the Citizens' Assembly is a more kind of true representation of democracy. Democracy means rule by the people. What we've got at the moment is rule by politicians who aren't as representative of the people as they need to be. So sortition will allow us to have ordinary people selected at random, but so that they're representative, making the decisions. We've got an example of this with the jury system, which is one of the saving graces of our legal system in the UK. And we've got examples of it, for example, in other countries. So for example, in Ireland, they've had a Citizens' Assembly, and that helped get the gay marriage, the abortion law and blasphemy laws changed in Ireland, which were topics that they kind of knew they needed to address, but they were too politically hot for the politicians to touch. So they gave it to the Citizens' Assembly, and the Citizens' Assembly, because it's representative people, it got popular support and people, and it created a pathway through. So that's what we need to happen with climate change. We know that we cannot rely on the current political system, we cannot rely on the current politicians to make the changes, because they haven't made them for the last 30 years, and because the fossil fuel lobby is so heavily invested in our cabinet, they're so heavily funded by fossil fuel lobbyists that we cannot rely on that. So we have to use the Citizens' Assembly. So that's the third of our demands. As a movement, what we aim to do, and the invitation for all of us to do, is to tell the truth and act on it as if it's real. And that sounds really simple, but it's actually quite challenging, because the truth is really challenging. It's not comfortable to look at the truth, and it's not comfortable to act on that truth as though it's real. It's much more comfortable to do what we've been doing for the last 30 years, which is to sort of not look at the truth fully, or then if we just sort of get a glimpse of it, to just carry on acting and maybe sort of make a few changes, but not make the fundamental changes that we need to make to address this truth. So what we try and do as a movement is a very simple thing. You can write it in a sentence like that, but it's quite a challenging thing to do. So I invite you to join us in working on what that means, how we tell the truth and we act on it as if it's real. And this is a departure from what's been happening in the last 30 years. What's been happening in the last 30 years, as I said before, is that the scientific community, the policy community, the advocacy communities, they've all sort of tried to make sense of the science and say, okay, but we'll tell people, not the truth, we'll tell people what we think they're ready to hear. And the reason they've done that is because the research shows if you tell the truth, you may end up with the bulk of people freezing, like rabbits in a headlight or ostrich head in the sand, and not acting. And the research shows, yes, perhaps most people will do that. There is a risk of that. But what the research shows more recently is if you tell the truth, what you'll get is a small group of people who will act appropriately. And that's what we're relying on. That's what actually, because we've been trying to tell the truth in a way we think people are ready to hear it, and it hasn't worked. We've ended going right to the edge of the cliff with this crisis. So let's try telling the truth and acting on it as if it's real, inviting those people that are willing to step up and act appropriately to do so. And that's what our whole movement's about, is trying to engage people who are willing to step up and to not be bystanders, but to be upstanders. And we draw on loads of research in that. So there's a whole load of research around community organising, and we use that to support our local groups and our local organising. But most importantly, we draw on research by people like Gene Sharp. And he has studied non-violent civil disobedience over the last, he started by studying Gandhi and has been through the civil rights movement and the whole of the rest of the 20th century. And he has written some really important books that have been picked up and used by community and civil rights, civil groups that have come together and defeated regimes that were autocratic and despotic. And through a whole series of kind of research and practices, he's honed that down to what you need to do to bring about the kind of change that we're talking about that's needed for addressing climate change. And the way we do that is we create inclusive mass participation movements that take civil disobedience. So it's disruptive because it has to be disobedient and disruptive in order to get attention. But it also means respect throughout. We're respectful for everyone, including the government, including the corporations, so that when we come to have the massive impact that we want to have and they sit around the table to negotiate, because we've maintained respect, it's easier for them to negotiate with us. It has a sacrificial element, and what we mean by that is we put ourselves, it's like you put yourselves where your speech is. So you don't just advocate that we need to make these changes, we step up and do that ourselves. So, for example, some of us are willing to get arrested, some of us are willing to go to prison. Doesn't mean that everyone in the movement has to be. It's a small minority of people that need to do that, but that within the movement we're willing to do that. That we're all crew, we're all involved in this. There's no hierarchy, there's no leaders. Everyone that wants to be part of this rebellion can be, and that we're all giving our time, we're all volunteering. And by having those elements, though, that it's respectful, it's disruptive, and it's sacrificial, by having that, what we generate is a backfiring. So we see that time and time again through successful social movements like the civil rights movement in America. When the police go in there with their water cannons and suppress a peaceful demonstration, people looking on see that in horror and sympathise with the demonstrators, with the activists. And that's what we see happening time and time again. So this backfiring, basically what we do is we create a dilemma. By taking this peaceful civil disobedience, we put the authorities in a dilemma. Either they allow us to do what we're doing, in which case we've expanded the space for peaceful protest, or they stop us doing what we're doing, they suppress it, and then they risk backfiring, and they risk more people joining us because they sympathise. So we put them in a dilemma, and in a way, it works for the rebellion whatever happens. If they let us carry on and do what we're doing, more people can join us and we can grow that way. If they suppress us and arrest us and put us in prison, or some of us, then that will generate more people to sympathise and join in. So that's the theory, that Gene Sharp and many others have worked out over the last sort of 50 years. And that's what we're drawing on in this movement. But we learn from every movement. So we learn from, as we see, Gandhi, the suffragettes, Martin Luther King. The guy in the hat in the middle is James Hansen. He's one of the world's top climate scientists. He brought this to the world's attention in the 1970s. And by the 1990s, he realised this was so serious that just being a scientist and just reporting the science wasn't enough. So he started to stand up and take civil disobedience and got arrested for the XL pipeline, for example. So he's seen that that's necessary. Similarly, Caroline Lucas, who's an MP, she got arrested at Balcombe against fracking because she's seen that this civil disobedience, non-violent civil disobedience, is an effective tactic which we need as part of our movement. And this isn't to say that everyone needs to get arrested and everyone needs to go to prison. There's a great example here within the black civil rights movement. And there's a brilliant YouTube video of this, actually, a documentary. If you're interested, I recommend having a look. It's the Freedom Riders. If you do a search on YouTube for Freedom Riders, you'll find this documentary and I recommend it. The Freedom Riders were a mix of white and black students who stood up in the summer in 1963 in America to oppose the segregation laws on the buses. And they risked physical attack from white supremacists, and they risked arrest and imprisonment from, actually, in the southern states, a very racist sort of government institutions that tried to break them by putting in these students into the most harsh prison that they had in the harshest state. And the students said, the first group arrived, and just a coachload of students, and they put them in prison. And they said, okay, if that's what it's going to take, let's fill the prison. So more and more students they sacrificed their degrees. Often it was the first generation to go to uni, and they sacked in their degrees because they knew this was such an important issue. And they filled the prison. By the end of the summer, in the space of a few months, there were 300 in the prison. And that was enough to generate a massive discussion in the whole country, and to change the law. So the bus companies dropped their segregation policies, and it was a key moment in the turning around of the civil rights movement in the States. So if 300 people going to prison in America, in a bigger country than ours, is enough to bring about that level of change, what would it take in the UK? And our research suggests that a movement of about 2 million of us, 2 million people, all on board with this rebellion, of which 3,000 are willing to get arrested and 300 willing to go to prison, would be enough to bring about the kind of change that we're talking about. So we need 2 million of us. We need everyone on board to step up, but we don't need everyone to be willing to get arrested or to go to prison. We just need enough people for that. And to be honest, we've already got, as we saw earlier, 100,000 people are sort of on social media. We've got 40,000 people on our newsletter already in just the space of a couple of months. And we've already got hundreds of people willing to go to prison and thousands of people willing to get arrested. So that's the kind of, in a sense, we've already got that bit. What we need now is the mass bit. We need more people to get involved, to bring up the numbers, to give the power to this movement. So I mentioned arrest. It's not the most important part of our movement. For those that are willing to do it, it's a key strategy. And the reason arrest is useful as a strategy is because it shows how serious the issue is. It raises the profile. If we can get, for example, 200 people arrested on an action in one day, that will generate headline news on a lot of the main newspapers, and that will bring the profile of the whole issue up. Because at the moment the government isn't telling the truth, we need to put a lot of pressure on it to get it to tell the truth. So that's why we use arrest, and that's why we use prison, to raise the profile, to show that we're serious. And it has another effect as well, because we know from our theory of social change that this movement is probably going to require some people getting arrested, those that are in a position where they can. It changes the way the police it. So we're also very open, we're non-violent, and so the police know that some of us are willing to get arrested, so that actually makes them more reluctant to arrest us. So that's what we've seen so far, is that there's been a lot less arrests than we were anticipating. So this slide is about motivation. What motivates us to take action on this? Traditionally, we might be motivated by a utilitarian sort of motivation of like, well, I'll do something if I think it's going to work, if I can see the impact it's going to have. The trouble with this issue is it's so big and complex, we don't know necessarily that we can succeed. It might be that we're already too late to stop runaway climate change. So there's another motivation that we encourage people to take on as well, which is that we ask, what does it mean to be human right now in this time, this challenging time when we've got this crisis that we face, this thing that's built up over the last 30 years and hasn't been addressed and needs addressing. What does it mean to be human in this time? And to do something because it's the right thing to do, rather than because you know it's going to have a certain outcome. So that's the motivation we try and bring to our action. So we don't come to an action going, well, we've got to get a certain outcome, we've got to, get X, Y, and Z achieved by doing this action, because that brings stress and tension. In order to stay non-violent, it's great to do an action going, I'm doing this because this is what I'm called to do right now. This is the right thing to do. Whether it works or not, it's the right thing to do. So that's a different kind of motivation. So that's one of the things that separates our movement. There's various aspects of the things I've just mentioned that make our movement different. How inclusive it is, the fact that it's using mass civil disobedience on this issue of climate change. It's about telling the truth. And this motivation is another part of that. So what have we achieved so far in the rebellion? So as I said, we launched on the 31st of October. We had a week of actions from November, on the 12th of November. We had the first rebellion day on the 17th of November. We had 6,000 people occupying 5 bridges in London. It was the largest piece of civil disobedience in the UK for decades. And that really helped. Each thing we've done has escalated the kind of following and the support. We've got, a growing amount of coverage. Then we did these swarming actions, which is a particular type where 20 to 50 people pop up in different parts of the city, blocking key intersections, just by blocking the traffic on a Pelican crossing for 7 minutes, letting the traffic flow again for 3 minutes, and then blocking again for 7 minutes. We have a whole team of people chatting to the drivers, explaining, apologising for the disruption, saying we don't want to disrupt individuals, but we have to get the message to the government. The government only cares about the economy, so we have to hit the economy. So that was incredibly successful. The police were there with no intention of arresting anyone for doing that for 3 days solid. They were there to protect our right to protest, and they were actually there to keep the peace, to make sure that there wasn't any irate drivers that were going to get violent because they knew we were non-violent. So that was incredibly successful, and it showed that kind of concept and something we want to work with more. This idea of swarming. So yeah, we've done a whole series of actions. And as I said, increasingly internationally, so the US declared the rebellion on the 26th of January. 119 countries, as I say, now are on board in some way or other. We've got hundreds of groups. Well, yeah, we did an action on the BBC as well on the 21st of December. That was to invite the BBC as our publicly funded broadcaster to tell the truth about climate change. And interestingly, the BBC coverage has started to shift. I mean, to be fair to them, it had started a little bit beforehand, but they were massively criticised by people like Philip Pullman for not covering the Rebellion Day on the bridges. You know, it's the biggest bit of civil disobedience in decades, and it got a 5-second mention on the BBC. So a lot of people quite rightly criticise them for that. So increasingly they are starting to cover it. We may do more actions on the BBC going forward. The big thing though, the big news is International Rebellion. This is going to start on the 15th of April and it's going to carry on. We don't know how long for. The answer is as long as it's necessary to bring about the change. We anticipate perhaps a week, maybe 2. So what we're asking people to do, this is where it's the big ask really, is to take off 2 weeks of your time, if you're able to, from the 15th of April. Now, if you can't manage 2 weeks, whatever you can manage. If it's just the day on the 15th, or if it's a couple of days, 3 days, whatever. But if people are able to saying, take 2 weeks off from the 15th of April, because if enough people join us in London on the 15th and onwards, we can bring about the change that's needed. The UN General Secretary says we've got this year to turn it around. So Extinction Rebellion, we're throwing everything we've got at the moment into the 15th of April. So we're doing these talks, we're supporting local groups, we've got a whole programme of actions building up to the 15th of April, which I'll talk about in a minute. And internationally, we're inviting people to do the same thing in other capital cities around the world. So that principle and value number 2 is we do what's necessary. We live in a London-centric society. The politics, the economy, the media, they're all in London. So to do what's necessary, we have to do stuff in London. It's great to do stuff locally in all of our local communities. And if at all possible, we'll get as many people as possible to London. And if you can't get to London, great, do stuff locally. But if at all possible, come to London for those 2 weeks. So as part of that build-up to the International Rebellion, we've got a series of 3 weeks of actions nationally and around the world. First week is starting next Friday, when the first UK-wide Strike for Climate is happening. So that's a school-based movement that started with an amazing schoolgirl called Greta Thunberg. She started striking against her parliament because of their criminal inactivity on climate change, and she's sparked this global movement. And so, for example, in Belgium, last Friday, they had their 4th week in a row with thousands of students striking. 30,000 were there last Friday. It's growing every week. So our first attempt to start to generate that kind of level of interest is this Friday coming on the 15th. And so we've got a week of actions. They're an independent sort of parallel organisation that we work closely with and support, but they're independent. And we also have got an action on the 22nd where some teachers are going to go to the Department of Environment and take civil disobedience, and potentially get arrested for the failure of our curriculum to tell the truth. So they're trying to get us to tell the truth in the curriculum as well. So there's a series of actions. In Bristol, they're going to be having a street party, street roadblock party, and doing a whole load of things. Different local groups around the country and around the world will be doing stuff in that week. Got a second week from the 9th of March to the 17th, and then a third week from the 24th of March to the 30th. And each week will escalate with more exciting, dramatic actions and more invitation for local groups to get involved in whatever way you want. You know, at the moment, just raising awareness is so important. Leafleting, sharing on social media. And then, as I said, the big thing then is to get all of that. Those actions are all about raising the profile to get as many people as we can there in London on the 15th of April and beyond. This is a picture from the Belgium strike last Friday with 30,000 people. And as I said, the big UK strike on the 15th of Feb. They're also going to have a global strike for climate on the 15th of March. So those are 2 dates that we can help to support. If you know any students that are interested in joining that, let them know about it, and also parents that are switched on that might work with their kids to support their kids in doing it. So that's the programme, the weeks of action. And so we have this approach, this theory of change, where everyone can have their role to play in this rebellion, whether it be at whatever level. So we're all on a journey with Extinction Rebellion, including myself. So we're all finding out about it and then looking at how we can get involved. And whatever contribution you can make at any stage is absolutely perfect. So for some people, it might be simply sharing it on social media or sharing it with your friends and family, colleagues, telling people about it. And now that we've got a local group forming in Northampton, telling them about that's happening, whatever. So like it on Facebook, whatever. There's a way in for everyone, right through to end up getting more involved, getting involved in the local group, forming an affinity group perhaps, or taking on an organisational role. But whatever level people want to get involved, they can. And also in whatever way you want to get involved. So don't expect to read these, but these different circles represent different working groups. So there's working groups on art, on legals, on finance, on actions and logistics, on outreach, on media. So whatever you love to do, you can do it in support for the rebellion. So that's the invitation really, is for people to get involved in whatever way, doing whatever you love to do, to get involved and bring that support, those talents, those skills to the rebellion. So I mentioned the working groups. We've got on all those different topics, art, legal, finance, whatever you love to do. We have a local group, so we've got this local group forming in Northampton. We've got hundreds of local groups around the UK and around the world. And then we've also got affinity groups. Affinity groups are like the building blocks of the movement. They're focused on action. An affinity group is a small group of 8 to 15 people that come together, get to know each other well, and take action together. And the beauty of that is a small group, so you can make decisions collectively and consensus really quickly and easily. You can get to know each other well and build trust in that small group. And because of our principle of autonomy and decentralisation, the affinity group is free to do actions as it agrees, as it wants to. So if there are some people that are willing to get arrested in the affinity group, you could do an action which could involve those getting arrested. If there's no one in the affinity group that's in a position where they want to get arrested, that's absolutely fine. You can do a different kind of action. So affinity groups come together to take action together. And that's, like, as I said, the building block of our movement. But that's the end of the talk. So now we've just got a last minute just in silence, and then another minute to reflect, and then we'll open up for question and answers. But so if I just invite you now just to have a minute just to reflect on, given what you've heard, what is an appropriate response? So just to kind of sit with that question for a minute. Given what I've heard, what is an appropriate response?